Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight, we are slipping quietly into a hidden corner of history, one you won't find in old etiquette books, and certainly not in the polite conversations of the 1920s. It is a story wrapped in silk, whispered behind closed doors, and tucked into the private lives of millions of women who lived a century ago. We usually imagine the roaring 20s as a parade of jazz bands, clinking glasses and dazzling flapper dresses, but behind the glitter and the photos in your history textbook was an entire world of secret routines, unspoken desires, and quiet rebellions carried out in the gentlest, most discreet ways imaginable. Tonight, we are setting aside the grand narratives of speakeasies and smoky city nights to look at something far more intimate: how ordinary women carved out small moments of peace, autonomy, and self-understanding in a society that insisted they should not even acknowledge having inner lives at all. To understand why this private universe mattered so much, we have to step back into the daily reality of a 1920s woman. She lived in a world that adored modernity on the surface: radios, automobiles, department stores, new fashions, rapidly changing social norms, but still clung, often tightly, to old expectations. A woman's worth was measured in her modesty, her decorum, her skill at presenting a serene, effortless household, and her ability to keep certain topics locked away, as if they simply did not exist. Conversations about happiness, emotions, independence, or personal fulfillment had strict limits. Polite society encouraged cheerfulness and beauty, but discouraged candid honesty about what life actually felt like. Imagine starting your day in that world. Breakfast served neatly, stockings pulled straight, hair bobbed but still curled to a standard approved by mothers, neighbors, and the little voice of etiquette books telling you how a proper lady should behave. You stepped into the street knowing every glance, every gesture, every word would be interpreted as a sign of your character. Women walked a tightrope, admired for elegance, judged for boldness, and expected to keep their composure under all circumstances. But behind the tidy hems and the carefully chosen hats, women were very much alive. They had curiosity, stresses, humor, private joys, and inner worlds richer than anyone around them could imagine. And because polite society gave them so few places to express those inner worlds openly, they created their own places: small, secret sanctuaries carved out of ordinary life. These sanctuaries were not always physical rooms. Sometimes they were moments. Sometimes they were rituals. Sometimes they were the simple act of closing a door, taking a breath, and finally letting their minds wander freely, without fear of what someone else might say. This, more than anything, is the heart of our story: the quiet strength it took for women to claim even a sliver of personal peace in an era built to limit them. Though these moments were small, they were powerful. They represented courage, resourcefulness, and a kind of gentle defiance: the belief that even within the boundaries society drew for them, they still deserved comfort, delight, and a connection to themselves. Every woman found this in her own way. Some created small nighttime rituals that allowed their thoughts to drift into places they could not discuss at tea or church. Others found refuge in a warm bath, where the sound of water covered the rest of the household's noise. Some found it in books passed quietly from friend to friend, stories that revealed feelings and ideas no one could speak aloud. Some found it by dancing alone, free from judgment, letting the rhythm of jazz loosen the weight of expectations. And many, especially those who lived in bustling cities, carved out these moments through little routines of solitude: brushing their hair longer than necessary, lingering by the radio when everyone else was asleep, or writing in diaries in coded language that protected their innermost thoughts. All of this existed beneath the surface of a society that proclaimed itself modern yet remained deeply resistant to acknowledging women's inner lives. Newspapers talked endlessly about new appliances, new fashions, and new forms of entertainment, but rarely about the emotional landscape of the women using them. Magazines offered guidance on beauty and household management, but avoided the deeper truth that women were thinking, feeling, yearning human beings with minds that reached far beyond the roles assigned to them. And that is where these private rituals become so meaningful. They were not trivial. They were not silly diversions. They were survival tools, ways to maintain identity, sanity, and a sense of personal truth in a world that often refused to see women as individuals. Each stolen minute was a quiet act of self-preservation. Picture a woman in 1924 sitting in her bedroom at the end of a long day. She has done the cooking, the mending, the errands, the social niceties, the tiny performances required of her from dawn to dusk. Now, in the soft glow of a bedside lamp, she finally exhales. The house is still. The windows are dark. The demands of the day finally loosen their grip. Maybe she opens the drawer of her nightstand, where she keeps a few precious private items. Maybe she brushes her hair slowly, enjoying the simple comfort of the bristles on her scalp. Maybe she lets the radio play a late-night jazz tune that makes her shoulders relax. In that moment, no one is watching. No one is judging. She is not expected to be graceful or charming or cheerful. She is simply herself. These small moments built a bridge between the daily obligations of a 1920s woman and the parts of her identity that had no outlet in public life. They allowed her to feel a sense of ownership over her body, her thoughts, and her emotions, not because society permitted it, but because she claimed it. It is easy today to underestimate how courageous that was. In an age where open discussion about women's feelings or personal needs was seen as improper, even thinking freely became a small rebellion. And yet millions of women did it, day after day, night after night, carving out their own paths toward self-understanding. These rituals also reveal something essential about human nature. When people are not allowed to speak openly about their needs, they find quiet ways to meet them. When society builds walls, individuals carve tunnels. And when the world is too loud, too demanding, too limiting, people seek refuge in the spaces where no one else can intrude. For the women of the 1920s, those spaces were often small but deeply meaningful: a locked bathroom door, a soft pillow, a scented powder, a book with folded corners, a drawer that clicked shut with a secret inside. The beauty of these stories is how universal they feel today. A century later, many of us still turn to similar rituals: late-night reading, warm baths, favorite music, a moment alone to breathe deeply and reconnect with ourselves. We may have more freedom now to talk about emotions or self-care, but the need for private sanctuary, for solitude, for personal comfort has not changed. The women of the 1920s remind us that even in restrictive circumstances, human beings find ways to express who they are. That quiet resilience is part of our shared history. So tonight, as we travel into this hidden world, we are not just looking at quirky old habits or outdated social rules. We are honoring the ingenuity of women who found ways to feel alive in a time that often denied them space to be fully themselves. Their stories shine a soft light on everything they were not supposed to say but felt anyway. And in those moments, those breaths, those rituals, those small escapes, we see not scandal but humanity. They remind us that joy, comfort, and self-connection are timeless. And that sometimes, the most powerful acts of freedom are the quiet ones, carried out behind lace curtains, inside warm baths, under bedside lamps, and behind the doors women learned to lock, not out of secrecy but out of self-preservation. In the 1920s, female desire and self-understanding were considered improper topics. Even acknowledging curiosity or emotional needs was taboo, forcing women to speak in whispers, hide their feelings, and navigate their inner worlds in secret. Tonight, let us step deeper into this hidden landscape, because to truly understand the inner lives of 1920s American women, we must first understand the walls society built around them. And perhaps more importantly, how they found doorways through those walls, sometimes quietly, sometimes boldly, sometimes with nothing more than a whispered confession to themselves. If the first part of our journey revealed the private pockets of comfort women created for themselves, then this next part uncovers the reason those pockets existed at all: the silence and stigma surrounding female desire. It is hard today, in an era with podcasts, open conversations, self-help books, and entire communities built around emotional wellness, to imagine what it felt like to live in a time when simply acknowledging your own inner world could be considered improper. And yet, that was the reality for millions of women in the 1920s. They lived at the height of modern change radios, cars, flapper culture while simultaneously living under values that reached back generations. Values that insisted women should be modest, calm, untroubled, and above all, silent about anything that might reveal too much of their private thoughts. In 1924, if a woman felt curious, lonely, overwhelmed, excited, or even hopeful, she often kept those feelings tucked tightly behind a polite smile. The world believed that good women did not think certain thoughts, did not feel certain emotions, and certainly did not discuss anything that hinted at deeper inner desires. Public conversations about female autonomy were still new, fragile things, usually framed in terms of political rights or economic participation, never emotional or personal exploration. The word desire itself not in the modern, explicit sense, but simply the desire for independence, joy, or self-expression carried a weight of suspicion. Women could desire a new dress, a new hairstyle, a new cookbook. But desire linked to self-understanding, that was treated as a threat to the order of things. It suggested individuality, complexity, agency. And agency was something society still tried to restrict, even as women cut their hair short and learned to vote. Imagine being a young woman in that era, living in a house where conversations were kept proper, reading magazines that told you how to host a dinner party but never how to navigate your own emotions. You might have questions, feelings, or moments of awakening, but there was no acceptable language to express them. So women developed their own languages, subtle gestures, careful phrases, coded notes and diaries, meaningful glances shared with friends who understood without needing explanation. Whispered truths passed over sewing tables or behind closed parlor doors. Even the physical vocabulary was limited. Women were taught to sit with their ankles crossed, hands folded neatly, voice soft and pleasant. To display anything resembling boldness was to risk judgment. To enjoy one's own company a little too much, that might invite gossip. To admit curiosity out of the question. And so, the world became a stage where women performed serenity while tucking their real feelings into hidden corners. Yet inside, beneath the smooth exterior of etiquette and expectation, women were very much alive. They laughed at the absurdity of the rules placed upon them. They exchanged secret stories. They found delight in small acts of rebellion: lipstick too red for their mother's taste, skirts a bit shorter than recommended, books that made their hearts quicken. The silence did not extinguish desire. It simply shaped how it could be explored. This silence extended even into medical language. When a woman felt restless, overwhelmed, or emotionally stifled, doctors rarely asked what she was feeling. Instead, they framed her experience as something external, something happening to her: nervous strain, delicate constitution, melancholy spells, mild exhaustion. Feelings were turned into symptoms because society could not imagine that women had inner worlds rich enough to create emotional complexity. And so the inner world became a condition, not a truth. As absurd as it sounds today, even curiosity was medicalized. A woman who asked too many questions might be gently redirected by family members. A woman who expressed boredom might be offered a new household task. A woman who wanted time alone might be told she was withdrawing too much from her duties. It was as though the world feared what women might discover if they spent too long in their own heads. This taboo created a paradox. Women were not supposed to desire anything beyond domestic harmony, yet they were surrounded by modernity. The jazz age pulsed around them with new rhythms, new fashions, new ideas. Radios crackled late into the night with voices that felt intimate and alive. Movies portrayed glamorous heroines experiencing emotions no one discussed at the dinner table. Department stores displayed fragrances, silk slips, and beauty products designed not for practicality but for confidence and sensory delight. Temptation and curiosity were everywhere, not in a forbidden sense but in a human sense. Women were encouraged to look beautiful, but discouraged from enjoying the feeling of beauty. They were encouraged to decorate their homes, but discouraged from claiming space for themselves. They were encouraged to embrace modern life as long as they did it quietly, without disturbing the structures built centuries before them. This tension between the old world of silence and the new world of possibility shaped the 1920s female. experience more deeply than anything else. It meant that each private moment held more weight. A warm bath was not just bathing. It was a rare moment of solitude. A scented powder was not just a cosmetic. It was a sensory escape. A quiet night with the radio was not just passing time. It was a secret meeting with a world larger than one's own home. And because desire was taboo, the very act of acknowledging one's desires even silently became a form of resistance. This resistance was not loud. It did not take the form of protests or speeches. It took the form of tiny, nearly invisible gestures, a woman lingering by her vanity a little longer, admiring the curve of her shoulder in the mirror. A housewife reading a novel that felt a touch too thrilling. A young woman staying awake to listen to her favorite radio host whisper into the late-night static. A flapper dancing alone in her bedroom just to feel the beat of her own heart. These gestures mattered, not because society recognized them, but because the women themselves did. Each one was a reminder: I exist. I feel things. I have an inner world that belongs to me. And in a time when female interiority was dismissed, these reminders were lifelines. Over time, this quiet culture of whispered self-recognition built a network of shared understanding among women. They might not speak openly, but they recognized the same spark in one another. A knowing smile, a joke delivered too quickly, a shared glance over a magazine advertisement. These were signals, as subtle as lace patterns, that said, we know more than we are allowed to say. This silent sisterhood helped normalize private autonomy in ways public discourse could not yet touch. It taught women to trust their own minds, to lean into their own experiences, to build their own rituals of comfort and discovery. And in doing so, it laid the groundwork for future generations to speak openly about the very things the women of the 1920s had to whisper. So when we look back at that era now, it is easy to see only the restrictions, the corsets, the etiquette rules, the expectations. But hidden within those restrictions was a generation of women quietly learning how to listen to themselves. And every time they did, even in the smallest ways, they took a step toward a more open, expressive future. The taboo did not disappear overnight. But the silence cracked slowly, softly, consistently, because millions of women whispered their truths to themselves long before society was ready to hear them out loud. Tonight, let us follow a different thread woven through the private lives of 1920s women, a thread that ran quietly through pharmacies, department stores, mail-order catalogs, and little glass counters lined with polished metal instruments. If the previous part of our story revealed the silence surrounding desire, this part uncovers how that silence shaped an entire industry, one built on coded language, gentle euphemisms, and a kind of almost conspiratorial understanding between manufacturers and the women who bought their products. To understand this strange, fascinating world, imagine stepping into a 1920s drugstore. The front of the shop smells like talcum powder, mint leaves, and freshly unwrapped paper packages. Rows of glass bottles catch the light: cough syrups, skin tonics, headache tablets, remedies for mild anxiety. Behind the counter, a pharmacist in a crisp white coat organizes shelves with careful precision. Everything looks ordinary, respectable, and reassuringly proper. But then your eye catches something strange: a row of devices displayed behind the glass, sleek chrome tools with elegant handles, attachments shaped like little rubber cushions or rounded caps. They sit alongside blood pressure cuffs and thermometers, but they do not quite belong to any medical category you are familiar with. A small card describes them as electric nerve relaxers, muscle stimulators, or remedies for household fatigue. The wording is vague, polite, and deliberately unclear. These machines were the heartbeat of a quiet revolution. Because even though no one said it out loud, millions of women understood exactly why these tools were being sold and why they were sold this way. They were presented as cures for nervous tension, stress-related discomfort, or general feminine unease. Yet these phrases were simply the socially acceptable vocabulary of the time, created to cover for something that polite society refused to name. Manufacturers were not naive. They knew there was a demand, an enormous one, for tools that offered comfort, relaxation, and emotional relief. But they also knew they had to speak in code. Anything too direct would invite scandal. So they chose the language of medicine, etiquette, and household care. They designed advertisements featuring respectable women in modest dresses sitting in tidy living rooms, using the device on their neck, shoulders, or temples. Never lower. Never suggestive. Always proper. And yet, every woman who bought one knew she was not purchasing something for her temples. This delicate dance between truth and marketing created a curious cultural phenomenon. It allowed women to purchase personal wellness tools in broad daylight without ever needing to justify themselves. All they had to do was smile politely and say something like, "I read that this helps with fatigue." Or, "My doctor mentioned something for nerves." The pharmacist would nod knowingly, not out of impropriety, but because this coded system worked well for everyone involved. It preserved dignity in an era obsessed with propriety. It kept conversations comfortable. And most importantly, it allowed women access to tools that brought them peace, relaxation, and a sense of agency over their well-being. Devices like these were not invented in the 1920s, but they became more accessible than ever before thanks to electricity. By the mid-20s, even modest households had electric sockets. Manufacturers seized the opportunity, creating machines that hummed gently, warmed slightly, or pulsed with adjustable rhythms. Advertisements promised that these gadgets would restore vitality, lift the spirits, or ease feminine strain. One particularly popular phrase from catalog descriptions was, "Recommended for the modern woman who manages many duties." That line alone carried an entire emotional truth. Women were managing many duties: cooking, cleaning, child rearing, social expectations, emotional labor, and often outside work as well. Life offered little private rest. So when a device claimed it could ease modern fatigue, women understood that it was not just speaking to the body, it was speaking to their souls. These massagers became symbols of something far larger than their polite descriptions. They became a quiet acknowledgement that women had needs, emotional, physical, and psychological, that society did not know how to talk about. They became a bridge between the invisible emotional landscape of women's lives and the visible world of acceptable consumer goods. Imagine a 1920s woman bringing one home for the first time. She might store it at the back of a dresser drawer beneath folded handkerchiefs. She would wait for nighttime, when the house finally quieted. A lamp dimmed. A window opened just enough to let in the breath of summer air. She would plug in the machine, listening to the soft hum that felt almost like a promise. For the first time all day, she had something that belonged purely to her, a moment, a space, a pulse of comfort she did not have to explain to anyone. In that moment, the device was more than a medical tool. It was a sanctuary. And because these devices had legitimate benefits, relaxing tense muscles, easing headache, pressure, calming nerves, they were never framed as indulgences. This was important. Women of that era were constantly told not to indulge themselves. To rest too much was laziness. To seek pleasure was improper. But to seek relief, that was acceptable. That one subtle difference allowed an entire underground culture of self-care to flourish under the banner of health and wellness. The marketing also offered protection. If someone stumbled upon the device, a woman could simply say it helped with her shoulders, or her stress, or her circulation. All true, none scandalous. And because these devices were often painted in soft pastel colors or crafted with elegant Art Deco lines, they looked like harmless household items, stylish, even in a modern home. There was no single type of woman who bought them. Young office workers, married housewives, widows living quietly on their own, teachers, telephone operators, seamstresses. Women from every corner of society found themselves drawn to something that promised comfort in a life that demanded constant composure. Perhaps the most fascinating part of this history is how manufacturers communicated without ever saying the forbidden words. The coded phrases became a language of their own. Restorative tonic, vitality enhancer, general relief instrument, helpful for feminine weakness, recommended by physicians for household fatigue, provides deep relaxation through rhythmic application. every sentence carefully polished, every word placed like lace edging around a truth too delicate to expose. This coded world did not trick women, it partnered with them. It gave them privacy without shame, permission without exposure, and autonomy without conflict. Women of the 1920s were experts at reading between lines. They had to be. Their entire emotional lives were shaped by rules and silence. So when a catalog described a product as an indispensable companion for the active woman, women understood the wink behind the words. And perhaps most touching is this. Though framed as tools for managing nerves, these gadgets often became part of personal rituals that soothed loneliness, helped manage stress, or simply offered a moment of comfort in an emotionally demanding world. They were mechanical, yes, but they symbolized something profoundly human. The longing for self-care, for emotional warmth, for a space free of judgment. In a society that insisted women remain composed, these tools offered gentle release. In a culture that dismissed female interiority, they affirmed it. In an era of silence, they hummed softly in the background, a quiet reminder that women's needs, though unnamed, were real. And so, behind the polished counters of drugstores and the respectable pages of mail-order catalogs, an entire world existed just beneath the surface, a world where women found comfort, healing, and a sense of control wrapped in chrome and marketed as medicine. Tonight, let us open another door into the private world of 1920s women, this time not through a bathroom mirror or a nighttime radio hum, but through the fragile pages of the era's mail-order catalogs. These catalogs were more than shopping tools. They were portals. They were confession booths. They were silent companions that slipped into homes across America wrapped in brown paper, promising modern convenience while whispering promises that went far deeper than household practicality. To understand the emotional weight of these catalogs, imagine sitting at a kitchen table in the 1920s, long after the evening dishes have dried. The house is quiet. A kerosene lamp glows softly. A magazine-sized booklet lays in front of you, Sears, Montgomery Ward, or one of the lesser-known specialty providers whose names have faded with time. Its pages are filled with everything from washing machines to garden seeds to musical instruments. But tucked between these innocent household essentials is something quite different, a single page, perhaps two, featuring personal wellness devices. The photographs are modest. The descriptions are vague. The fonts are delicate. The phrases gentle, as if the page itself is whispering. You can almost feel the catalog inviting you to read between the lines. Phrases like, a restorative device for tension relief. A modern appliance for managing feminine fatigue. For circulation, vitality, and the comfort of the modern household. Nothing explicit. Nothing alarming. Nothing that would raise eyebrows if someone else glanced over your shoulder. And yet, every woman who lingered on those pages understood what they offered, not scandal but refuge. Not rebellion but relief. In an age where emotional honesty was discouraged and curiosity was contained, the catalog page became a small act of courage. Mail-order shopping suited the era perfectly because it preserved privacy in a world obsessed with appearances. Women did not have to walk into a store and risk meeting a neighbor's eyes. They did not have to speak to a pharmacist. No one had to see their face redden or their voice soften with embarrassment. Instead, they simply filled out an order slip, tucked it into an envelope, and dropped it into a mailbox on a quiet afternoon, perhaps while pretending to send a recipe request or a letter to a distant cousin. A few weeks later, a package would arrive, wrapped in plain paper. No markings. No questions asked. And inside was something that promised more than the advertisement ever admitted. This quiet system created a bridge between a woman's outer life, the polite, polished, ever-controlled life, and her inner world, full of complexity, need, tenderness, and longing for a moment of peace. The catalog allowed two versions of herself to meet without conflict. The public woman remained proper. The private woman felt understood. Mail-order companies knew exactly what they were doing. They crafted their language with surgical precision. Every word was designed to soothe, comfort, and reassure. Phrases like, approved by health experts of the day. A gentle solution for restlessness, strain, or the pressures of modern domestic life. Discreetly packaged for your convenience. These words did not just describe a product, they created an entire emotional ecosystem. They told women you are not alone. Your needs are valid. And we can help you without exposing you. In many ways, these catalogs became a form of emotional intimacy women were not allowed to express anywhere else. They could sit alone, turn the pages slowly, and imagine a world where comfort was not a luxury or a moral question but a right. Where well-being was not seen as indulgence but as maintenance. Where no one judged them for wanting something gentle, soothing, or comforting. And because the catalog arrived in every corner of the country from big cities to rural farms, this quiet revolution reached women who might otherwise have had no one to confide in. Imagine a farmer's wife in Nebraska, living miles from the nearest neighbor. Or a seamstress in Chicago sharing a room with her sister. Or a widowed schoolteacher in a small New England town. Each woman flipping through the same pages, reading the same coded language, feeling the same mix of curiosity, longing, and relief. This shared experience created an invisible sisterhood, one that crossed social classes, state lines, and lifestyles. Women who would never meet in person found themselves united through a single, discreet page in a catalog that understood them better than most people in their lives did. The artistry of these catalogs lay in the way they acknowledged needs without naming them. They understood the delicate dance of the 1920s. Women were modern enough to seek autonomy but still bound by old expectations of modesty. So the catalogs positioned their devices as tools for health, comfort, or restoration. They used illustrations of hands typing on a typewriter or lifting laundry to justify why a woman might feel fatigue or strain. They never implied shame, never invited judgment, never crossed the boundary of propriety. Instead, they shaped desire into something socially acceptable, wellness. And women embraced this framing because it gave them what society refused to give: permission to care for themselves. It is important to remember that these catalogs were not subversive in a rebellious sense. They were not trying to undermine social norms. They were simply responding to needs that had been ignored for too long. Their purpose was not political. It was practical. But in being practical, they became quietly transformative. They made comfort accessible. They made privacy safe. They made self-care possible in a way the outside world still refused to acknowledge. Picture again a woman sitting with her catalog. She might smooth her hand over the page, trace the outline of a device with her fingertip, imagining how its gentle hum might feel against her skin after a long day. She is not thinking of scandal. She is thinking of rest, of relief, of having a moment that belongs solely to her. And when she finally mails that order slip, she is not breaking rules, she is choosing herself. When the package arrives, she might hide it beneath linens or tuck it into a nightstand drawer. She might keep the instructions folded inside a book. Every step is quiet, not because she is ashamed, but because she is protecting something precious, her small space of comfort in a demanding world. And in this way, catalog culture did more than sell products. It redefined the concept of private well-being for a generation of women. It offered what society did not: acknowledgement, respect, understanding. It whispered, "You deserve this," even if no one ever says so. Through the coded pages of mail-order catalogs, women learned something powerful, that even when the world refused to speak openly about their needs, they could still meet those needs themselves quietly, confidently, and without apology. As we turn these pages with them a century later, it becomes clear that the story is not about the devices themselves. It is about the courage it took to claim comfort in a world that rarely extended it freely. It is about the ingenuity of women who, even in silence, found ways to care for their minds, bodies, and spirits. And most of all, it is about the unspoken truth that every woman of that era understood the moment she opened a catalog. The world might not have been ready to acknowledge her inner life, but she was. Tonight, let us step into a completely different kind of space, not the hush of a drugstore, not the coded pages of a mail-order catalog, but a place far more intimate and universal: the bathroom. Of all the rooms in a 1920s home, This was the one location where a woman could lock the door without raising suspicion. A bathroom was not luxurious. It was not designed for reflection. But in practice, it became something incredibly precious, a sanctuary. Imagine the era clearly. In many families, the bathroom was just a small rectangle with white tiles, porcelain fixtures, and a mirror that slightly distorted the edges of your reflection. Some rural homes still relied on wash basins and tin tubs, filled manually with kettles of warmed water. But whether modern or modest, the space served a single magical purpose: it allowed a woman to be alone. In a world where her presence was constantly required in the kitchen, in the parlor, in the social sphere, the solitude of a bath was like a small island of peace floating in the middle of a demanding day. When a woman closed the bathroom door, for that precious window of time, she was no longer a hostess, a daughter, a wife, a mother, an employee, or a caretaker. She was simply herself. And that, in the tightly structured world of the 1920s, was a rare experience. Let us imagine her entering this space at the end of a long day. The house is full of voices and tasks, but she slips in quietly, carrying a bar of soap wrapped in paper, perhaps a small tin of scented powder, and a towel she chose for its softness, not its practicality. She turns the faucet or pours water carefully if her home has not been updated, and the room begins to change. The air grows warm. The mirror fogs around the edges. The sound of water creates a curtain of privacy thicker than any lock could provide. In this warmth, she finally exhales. For women of that era, the bathtub was not just a place to wash, it was a place to release the weight they carried all day. Here, the silence felt gentle, not empty. The warmth felt comforting, not indulgent. And the simple sensation of being enveloped in water offered something their daily lives rarely granted: a return to their own bodies. In the 1920s, women were expected to move gracefully, dress elegantly, and present themselves as effortlessly composed. But in the bath, the need to perform faded. The bath did not care if you were tired. It did not mind if your hair was pinned sloppily or if your thoughts were messy. It welcomed you exactly as you were. Many women developed rituals around their baths. Not out of vanity, but out of necessity. A bath was the only place where they could truly think, where their minds could wander freely, where the inner voice they kept quiet all day finally had room to speak. Some women lingered with aromatic soaps, lavender, rosewater, or citrus, barely affordable but treasured. Some used soft brushes to massage their shoulders, imagining tension drifting away with the ripples. Some simply rested, letting their bodies float in silence. Others used this time to daydream about lives they could not talk about openly, traveling, writing, pursuing something beyond what society prescribed. The bathroom became a dream space. And because water has always been symbolic of renewal, cleansing, rebirth, the bath naturally took on emotional meaning. It was not about luxury. It was not about glamour. It was about reclaiming inner stillness. Water blurred the sharp edges of the day. The warmth softened the thoughts that felt too heavy to carry. The steam created a kind of cocoon where worries seemed to dissolve more easily. Even in homes where privacy was scarce, the bath offered an excuse no one questioned. "I'm taking a moment to wash." It was a sentence that protected a woman from interruptions, from judgment, from the never-ending circle of expectations. Inside that door, she could hear her own heartbeat again. For some, the bath carried memories. Maybe a mother once washed her hair in a warm basin as a child. Maybe she remembered summer days spent by a river. Maybe the scent of soap reminded her of a simpler time. These small sensory memories gave emotional texture to a nightly routine. Warm water was not just water. It was nostalgia. It was softness. It was her world slowing down. As modern plumbing improved, the bath also became a symbol of modern womanhood. Magazines began showcasing bathroom designs as signs of sophistication. Advertisements encouraged women to embrace daily refreshing rituals to maintain poise and elegance. Though still coded in the polite language of beauty, these advertisements acknowledged something deeper: that women needed spaces to care for themselves without explanation. But in truth, women had known this long before magazines admitted it. The bath became a place where many 1920s women confronted emotions they had no outlet for. Loneliness, stress, hopes, quiet triumphs, small heartbreaks, moments of pride they could not express out loud, and moments of exhaustion they were not allowed to show. Here in the bath, for a little while they did not have to be strong. They could let tears blend invisibly with water. They could let their minds drift into fantasies. They could recall tender moments or imagine future ones. The bath held these secrets without betrayal. For some women, the bath offered something even more powerful, a rare sense of ownership over their own bodies. In a society that constantly dictated how a woman should look, behave, walk, speak, and dress, feeling her own skin under warm water reminded her that she belonged to herself too, not only to the roles she played. This was not dramatic. It was not rebellion. It was human. Women who lived with tension in their shoulders, tightness in their breath, or restlessness in their hearts found quiet relief here. Women whose days were filled with labor scrubbing floors, sewing late into the night, typing in cold offices were soothed by the simple act of submerging their hands in warm water. Women who felt unseen suddenly felt grounded. The sounds of the bath dripping, splashing, the soft hum of pipes became a soundtrack of self-preservation. The light in the bathroom was different too. Lamps reflected off porcelain in a gentle glow. Even sunlight looked softer when bouncing off tiles. This lighting offered kindness to women who spent their days under the critical eyes of society. In this softened light, they did not need to scrutinize themselves. They could rest. And rest was the most radical gift a woman could give herself in the 1920s. Once the bath ended, she would step out renewed but reluctant, wrapping herself in a towel, lingering against its warmth, knowing that once she opened the door, the world outside would return with all its demands. She would resume her roles. She would resume her responsibilities. But she would carry with her a small piece of the calm she found behind the closed door. The bathtub, then, was not merely a household feature. It was a quiet revolution disguised as hygiene. It was a ritual of emotional maintenance hidden behind socially acceptable behavior. It was a private retreat accessible to everyone, whether rich or poor, urban or rural. In the hush of warm water, 1920s women found something their world rarely offered them. A moment where they could breathe. A moment where they could feel. A moment where they could simply be. And in that stillness, they reclaimed something priceless, the right to exist beyond expectation. Tonight, let us step into the quietest hour of a 1920s household, the time when the lights dim, the corridors cool, and the world narrows down to the soft glow of a radio dial. If the bathtub offered women solitude of the body, then nighttime radio gave them solitude of the mind. And in ways no one at the time quite predicted, radio became one of the most intimate companions. Women had a voice in the dark, a melody that drifted straight into the heart, a small rebellion disguised as entertainment. To feel its impact, imagine a typical home in 1925. The day has been full of clatter, pots hitting stove grates, children calling for attention, footsteps crossing wooden floors, streetcars groaning outside. But by evening the atmosphere shifts. Lamps soften. Curtains are drawn. The house exhales alongside its tired inhabitants. And somewhere in a corner, on a side table, a dresser, or the shelf of a modest parlor, sits a radio. It is a wooden box with a warm yellow dial, a faint buzzing hum, and a fabric-covered speaker. During the daytime, it plays news bulletins, weather updates, and comforting family programs. But at night, when the rest of the house has gone still, it becomes something else entirely. Its glow feels personal. Its sound feels confidential. And for millions of women, it becomes a doorway into parts of themselves they are not allowed to express in daylight. A woman in the 1920s might wait for this hour all day. She might stand by the windows for a moment, checking that the neighborhood has settled into its own hush. She might make sure her chores are finished or at least abandoned with a sense of earned defiance. Then she turns the radio knob, slowly, tenderly, as though waking a friend. Static fills the air for a moment, sharp, crackling, alive. Then a voice emerges. Smooth, warm, calm. A voice trained to sound like it belongs only to the listener. Radio hosts of the time understood something magical. Their words reached people who were alone, tired, reflective, or yearning for a sense of connection. And though they spoke to thousands at once, each listener felt as if the message was meant only for them. For a 1920s woman, whose world revolved around duty and presentation, that singular feeling of being spoken to not as a role, not as an ornament, but as a person was revolutionary. And then came jazz. Jazz was not just music. It was a mood, a permission slip, a pulse that said life could be larger and freer than the narrow pathways society allowed. Even when played softly through small radio speakers, jazz carried a kind of emotional electricity. It made hearts flutter. It made restless minds settle. Woke dreams that had been tucked away like old letters hidden behind a dresser drawer. Late at night, jazz transformed a dim bedroom into a secret world. A world where a woman did not have to maintain poise. A world where she could sway slightly, almost imperceptibly, even if only under a blanket. A world where her thoughts could wander into territories polite society never let her visit. Imagine her listening to a melancholy trumpet drifting gently over the airwaves. The notes bend, stretch, linger. They hold her emotions like delicate thread. Or imagine her hearing a piano rhythm bright with spark and mischief, making her foot tap under the covers a tiny private dance step she would never dare show in public. Jazz was modernity in sound form. It was unpredictable yet tender, expressive yet controlled. Much like the women listening to it, the beauty of late-night radio was that it offered a woman something she rarely had during the day: permission to feel without explanation. If she felt lonely, the radio did not shame her. If she felt hopeful, the radio amplified it. If she felt exhausted, the radio comforted her. If she felt dreams stirring inside her, the radio whispered, "It is all right to imagine." A simple melody could unlock memories from her youth, hopes for the future, or fantasies she never spoke aloud. And there, in the soft quiet of night, she could reflect on her own life with a sense of gentle honesty, something society rarely encouraged. This quiet ritual was not dramatic. It was not rebellious. Yet it carried a kind of quiet courage. A woman who listened to jazz after midnight was not just passing time, she was protecting her inner world. She was nurturing thoughts that had no other home. She was reminding herself that she was more than her daily list of obligations. And the radio understood her need for privacy. Its glow did not judge. Its music did not ask questions. Its voices did not demand a polished smile. In the diary entries of the time, often written in coded language, women described these nighttime moments as my drifting hour, my quiet company, or my soft window into the world. Those phrases reveal something important. The radio created a sense of connection without burden. In a time when a woman's social interactions were full of expectations, etiquette rules, and emotional labor, the radio asked nothing of her. It simply offered presence. Jazz made this presence feel alive. Its unexpected rhythms mirrored the unexpected corners of a woman's inner life. Its soaring melodies made her feel that her dreams were not foolish. Its quiet passages reminded her that her emotions had a place in the universe. Some women listened while brushing their hair. Long, meditative strokes in rhythm with the music. Some listened while lying on their backs, eyes closed, letting the sound become a blanket. Some listened while writing letters they would never send. Some even danced alone in the soft lamplight, small steps, gentle hips, graceful turns, invisible to everyone but entirely real to themselves. These dances were not performances. They were personal affirmations. I am here. I am alive. I feel things deeply. And this moment belongs to me. For women who spent their days being careful with words, careful with posture, careful with emotions, jazz offered a place where they did not have to be careful at all. It did not mind if their feelings were messy. It did not mind if their hearts were complicated. It did not mind if they were searching for something they could not name. The music simply flowed through the room and let them exist. And perhaps the most remarkable part of this entire phenomenon was how universal it became. Women in big cities, small towns, farms, boarding houses, and apartment buildings all shared this quiet ritual. They listened to the same voices, the same songs, the same midnight jazz solos. Miles apart, they formed an invisible community, unspoken, yet deeply connected. While the world saw them as housewives, workers, mothers, caretakers, hostesses, or daughters, the radio saw them simply as human beings with inner landscapes that deserved to be nourished. And so, in the secret glow of a radio dial, 1920s women discovered something extraordinary, that their emotions had a right to exist. That they could feel deeply, imagine freely, and rest quietly in the company of melodies that asked for nothing but listening. The radio became their nighttime window into themselves. Jazz became the soundtrack to the lives they were not allowed to talk about. And together they created a gentle rebellion, a soft, glowing, humming reminder that every woman has an inner world, whether society chooses to acknowledge it or not. Tonight, let us step into a moment so small and so private that it rarely appeared in diaries, photographs, or letters, yet it existed quietly in countless homes. A moment when the rest of the world slept, when the curtains were drawn shut, when the carpet felt soft under a woman's bare feet, and when the radio hummed a rhythm that seemed to belong only to her. A moment when she stood up, took a breath, and allowed herself to sway, alone in the dim light. This was the secret ritual of solo dancing, a ritual almost invisible to history, yet deeply significant to the women who lived it. To understand why this mattered, imagine again the life of a 1920s woman. Her days were structured, repetitive, full of expectations: set the table, attend social visits, sew, iron, type in an office, manage a household, soothe children, listen politely, maintain appearance, present composure. Every movement she made in public was watched, interpreted, silently judged. Even at parties, dancing was choreographed by rules: foxtrot steps, waltz circles, polite distances, and proper posture. Dancing in public was performance, coordination, presentation. But dancing alone at night, that was freedom. It was the one moment where her body did not belong to etiquette. It belonged to her. Picture her late in the evening. The house is quiet. A single lamp casts a warm amber patch of light against the wall. The shadows stretch long across the floorboards. She turns the radio knob or sets a record spinning. A saxophone sighs. The piano dances lightly. A trumpet flutters its melody like a heartbeat trying to escape the day. She does not start dancing immediately. At first she listens. The music washes the noise of her day away, all the expectations, all the politeness, all the small emotional burdens she carried silently. Then her fingers begin tapping on her thigh. Maybe her shoulders loosen. Maybe she hums quietly. And then, when she feels safe enough, safe from interruption, from judgment, from the watchful eyes of society, she rises. Her first steps are small. A gentle sway. A shift of weight from foot to foot. No choreography. No partner to impress. No one to adjust her posture. It does not matter if her steps are not graceful. It does not matter if she forgets the formal dances taught at school. She is moving for herself. This moment of solo dancing became a form of emotional release that women could not access anywhere else. In the swing of her hips, she could let go of tension. In the lift of her arms, she could express joy no one else asked her to hide. In the twist of her body, she could release anxiety she was never allowed to talk about freely. Each movement was a quiet rebellion, not against people, but against the suffocation of constant composure. Jazz made this easier. Jazz was not a tidy genre. It did not follow strict rules. It did not care if rhythms bent strangely or if melodies wandered off like daydreams. And in that looseness, women found permission to loosen themselves. To move in ways that did not fit into social structure. To follow the music instead of rules. To feel rhythm instead of restraint. Some women danced barefoot so they could feel the vibrations through the floor. Some danced in stockings, letting the fabric slide smoothly over the carpet. Some danced in nightgowns that flowed like second skin. Some danced fully dressed, unable to wait for a change of clothes after the day ended. No two dances were the same. And no dance ever needed to be repeated. These dances carried emotions women could not articulate out loud. If she felt overwhelmed, she moved heavily, her body grounding itself. If she felt hopeful, she twirled lightly, letting the air lift her. If she felt stuck in her daily routine, she stepped in patterns that belonged to no one but herself. She felt lonely. The music became a companion, not a human one, but an emotional one, filling the room with warmth. Solo dancing was a confession without words. It allowed a woman to say to herself, "I feel tired. I feel alive. I feel unseen. I feel hopeful. I feel something I can't name." And she could say all of this with her body without anyone ever hearing it. What makes this ritual so powerful is not the movement itself, but the contrast between her public life and her private one. By day, she moved within narrow boundaries, footsteps measured, gestures polite, posture enforced by the social gaze. By night, in this little pocket of time, her movements became untamed, unstructured, honest. Even if she never admitted it to anyone, dancing allowed her to reconnect with something primal that society had slowly trained out of her: instinct. And instinct was important because instinct meant identity. Not the polished identity that fit into the 1920s ideal of womanhood, but the authentic one underneath. Some women describe these dances years later as my breath returning, my secret heartbeat, or simply my hour of lightness. These poetic phrases reveal everything. Solo dancing was not about performance. It was about survival. It was about maintaining a connection with parts of themselves that the era tried to suppress. Sometimes she would close her eyes while dancing, letting the room fall away. She was not thinking of who she was supposed to be. She was remembering who she actually was. A dreamer. A thinker. A person capable of desire, not in the censored sense, but in the human sense: desire for joy, adventure, laughter, softness, escape, meaning. For a few minutes, she left behind her roles and returned to her essence. Even her breathing changed. During the day, her breaths were shallow, polite, restrained, controlled. During her dance, they became full, deep, liberating. Her body remembered itself. Her chest lifted. Her shoulders loosened. The world seemed to soften with every inhale. This renewal made her better equipped to face the next day. Dancing did not erase her responsibilities, but it strengthened her spirit. It was like lighting a small candle inside herself that would keep glowing even after the music stopped. And perhaps most touching of all, this ritual was universal in its secrecy. Women danced alone in tiny apartments in New York, farmhouses in Kansas, boarding rooms in Chicago, attics converted into bedrooms, quiet southern homes with cracked wooden floors, suburban living rooms decorated with lace curtains, and city flats filled with the smell of street vendors below. The rhythm of jazz connected women who would never meet, an invisible chain of gentle movements occurring across the country each night. And no one ever spoke of it. Not because it was shameful, but because it was sacred. A private treasure. A flicker of inner freedom. A brief return to the self. When she finally stopped dancing, breath warm, heartbeat steady, cheeks flushed softly, she would sit back down, letting the music fade, letting the quiet settle around her like a blanket. Then she would turn off the radio, switch off the lamp, slip into bed. And as she closed her eyes, she carried with her the memory of movement, a reminder that somewhere deep inside her, untouched by expectation, lived a piece of herself that no one could contain. Solo dancing, in its secrecy and simplicity, became the purest expression of emotional freedom that 1920s women had. It was gentle rebellion, private poetry, a whisper of selfhood in a world that often demanded silence. Tonight, let us open yet another invisible chapter in the private life of 1920s women, a chapter woven not with words but with thread. not discussed aloud but felt through fabrics that brushed softly against the skin. If bathing gave women solitude and radio gave them emotional space, then lingerie, the soft underlayer of their wardrobes, gave them something much more intimate, a sense of self they could carry all day, no matter what the outside world demanded. To understand this, imagine stepping into a woman's room in the early morning. The light is new, pale gold, slipping through lace curtains. On a small chair sits her dress for the day, modest, structured, proper. But next to it, neatly folded, are pieces that belong not to the world, but to her, a silk slip that gleams faintly even in low light, a pair of stockings rolled delicately like petals, perhaps a chemise embroidered with a tiny floral pattern no one else will ever see. These garments were rarely spoken about. They were not meant for display or admiration. They were not part of fashion in the public sense. Instead, they were part of a woman's private emotional architecture, a hidden foundation that shaped how she moved through the world. Unlike outer garments, which followed rules and expectations, lingerie belonged entirely to her inner life. Picture her unfolding a silk slip between her fingers. The fabric falls like water. Cool at first, then warming in her hands. Silk was expensive for many women. Yet even those who lived modestly often saved for one treasured piece, not to impress anyone, but to remind themselves that life could feel beautiful, even quietly. When she slipped it over her skin, she was not thinking of the world outside. She was not thinking of society's expectations or the day's endless tasks, or the subtle pressures to appear perfect. In that small moment, the slide of fabric, the softness at her waist, the whisper of lace against her collarbone, she felt something the rest of the day rarely allowed: inner worth. Lingerie, for 1920s women, became a secret affirmation. Not vanity, not seduction, not display, but a gentle whisper. I deserve softness. I deserve beauty. I deserve moments meant just for me. The world might see her as composed, dutiful, modest, but beneath her dress, she carried a layer of personal truth. The way fabrics felt mattered. Silk was not just smooth, it made her feel refined, even if she lived in a cramped apartment. Satin was not just shiny, it made her feel confident, even if she spent her day in a noisy typing pool. Lace was not flashy, it made her feel delicate in the most human sense, not fragile but cherished. These textures offered emotional comfort at a time when women were encouraged to suppress their emotions. A slight brush of silk reminded her that softness was still part of life. A hidden embroidery near her hem reminded her that beauty did not always need an audience. Stockings clasped gently at her thigh reminded her that she had structure and resilience of her own. And all of this lived beneath clothing that might appear plain, simple, or practical. Because the power of lingerie did not lie in being seen by others, its power lay in being known by her. Some women kept a small box for their favorite pieces: satin ribbons, lace edges, silk camisoles carefully folded. Opening this box was like opening a drawer of secrets. The colors were soft blush pink, ivory, dusty blue, warm cream. Shades chosen because they felt kind to the eye, kind to the heart. These garments were more than objects. They were emotional artifacts. When a woman wore fine undergarments, her posture shifted subtly. Not because she wanted attention, but because she carried a sense of inner pride. She moved with slightly more assurance. She walked with a quiet confidence. Even if her outer life was full of duties and controlled roles, beneath it all she felt a piece of freedom. And freedom, no matter how small, mattered. Many women lived in environments where external expression was limited. But lingerie allowed them to express themselves internally. They felt bold. They might choose a silk slip with a daring cut at the neckline, though no one else would ever see it. If they felt gentle, they might choose a cotton chemise with tiny embroidered flowers. If they felt tired, they might choose their softest piece, worn from years of washes, comfortable like an old friend. These choices were conversations with themselves. Daily reminders of who they were beyond duties, beyond expectations, beyond the performances required of them. In a sense, lingerie became a woman's first language of self-care decades before the phrase even existed. During a time when people spoke of female modesty more than female identity, these quiet garments helped women reclaim a sense of selfhood. They were not meant to challenge society directly. They were not political statements. They were private affirmations that said, "I am more than what the world sees." The 1920s were an era of transition. Hemlines rose, hair shortened, and the idea of the modern woman began to bloom. But even before society recognized women as modern, lingerie helped them feel modern inside themselves. Slips replaced older, heavier corsets. Fabrics grew lighter. Movements became freer. Even if outer fashion changed slowly, the inner transformation was immediate. A woman could feel liberated long before she was allowed to look liberated. And for many, lingerie served as a reminder of adulthood, not in a burdensome way, but in a celebratory one. It symbolized autonomy, control, choice, ownership over something intimate and personal. Imagine her on a morning when she feels weary. She slips into a silk chemise and feels a quiet comfort settling around her. She fastens her stockings, feeling the gentle snap of the garter. She smooths her hands down the satin at her hips and thinks, if only for a second, everything will be all right. This is not luxury. This is resilience stitched into fabric. Throughout the day, while sweeping the porch, typing letters, folding laundry, riding a streetcar, she carries this layer of quiet empowerment under her clothing. No matter how chaotic the world becomes, she knows something soft touches her skin. Something beautiful even if unseen. And in this secret beauty, she holds on to a part of herself that no one else controls. It is easy, a century later, to underestimate the emotional significance of such simple garments. But for women who had little room to express themselves openly, lingerie was a private rebellion of tenderness in a world that often demanded hardness. It told them that softness was not weakness. That beauty was not vanity. That intimacy with oneself was not selfish. That identity could be worn quietly, beneath everything else. And perhaps this was the most powerful truth of all. In a life lived outwardly for others, lingerie allowed a woman to live inwardly for herself. When she undressed at night, the feel of lace slipping away from her shoulder, the sound of silk brushing against her skin, the release of the day's final layer, all of it reminded her that she could still connect with herself. That beneath the exhaustion, beneath the roles, beneath the expectations, she had a private world no one could touch. This world was stitched into every delicate thread, and it belonged entirely to her. Tonight, let us open one of the most misunderstood chapters of women's lives in the 1920s, a chapter wrapped in white coats, soft glowing clinic lamps, polished brass instruments, and a vocabulary so delicate it often hid more than it revealed. A chapter where doctors spoke in distant terms like melancholy spells or nervous imbalance, even while women themselves felt emotions they had no socially acceptable way to express. To understand this world, you must imagine the era clearly. The 1920s were a time of rapid change: cars, radios, telephones, jazz, urbanization, yet emotional understanding lagged far behind. Women were expected to be composed, gentle, pleasant, and untroubled. When they struggled with stress, loneliness, exhaustion, or emotional weight, society did not know how to interpret these feelings. Instead of acknowledging emotional truth, it created a medical label for it: hysteria. Hysteria was a word so broad, so vague, that it became a kind of catch-all drawer where society placed any emotion in women it did not understand: sadness, anxiety, restlessness, frustration, boredom, or simply the desire for a life larger than the one assigned. Once a feeling became a condition, doctors believed it needed a treatment. But the treatments themselves were rarely about curing anything. They were about offering comfort in a world unwilling to admit that women had complex emotional lives. Picture a clinic in 1923. The waiting room is quiet. Soft ticking from a clock. A faint smell of polished wood and menthol. Magazines neatly arranged, all featuring serene women on their covers. A woman arrives, her gloves buttoned, her hat pinned neatly. She sits politely, though her hands are clasped a little too tightly in her lap. She has come because she feels something she cannot name or something she cannot say aloud without being misunderstood. When the doctor calls her in, his tone is gentle, practiced. You have been overworked. You need rest. You are delicate. You have nervous strain. He might ask a few questions, but rarely about her emotional life. He does not ask about loneliness, unmet dreams, or the invisible burden of expectations. Instead, he prescribes a therapy for relief, a treatment framed as clinical and respectable, yet designed to soothe a woman's nerves in ways physical rest alone could not. The word therapy in the 1920s carried a strange dual meaning. It was medical, yes, but it also served as a socially permissible cloak for emotional needs women were not allowed to express. Therapies might include gentle massages for circulation, calming electrical treatments for nerve balance, a light-based therapies meant to lift the spirits, warm compresses for muscle fatigue, rest cures in quiet rooms with soft music. All of them framed delicately, scientifically, politely. But beneath all this polite language lay something simple. Women needed comfort. They needed stillness. They needed kindness. But the world was not ready to admit that emotional needs were real needs. So medicine stepped in, not knowingly, not maliciously, but in a clumsy attempt to help without challenging social norms. These treatments often took place in softly lit rooms with curtains partially drawn. The smell of lavender oil or eucalyptus might hover in the air. A nurse might prepare warm towels. A doctor might speak in reassuring tones, even if he did not fully understand what the patient was feeling. The environment was crafted to convey safety. And in truth, that safety mattered more than the treatments themselves. For a woman who spent her life caring for others, being cared for even for half an hour was transformative. The medical setting gave her an excuse to receive this care without guilt. She did not have to justify needing comfort. The doctor said she needed it, which meant it was allowed. Proof. Respectable. And so women came, often regularly, not because they were ill, but because these treatments offered emotional release disguised as medical necessity. The language of diagnosis stress of modern life, nervous tension, digestive unease, excess worry was not accurate, but it opened a door society refused to open emotionally. Behind closed clinic doors, women let themselves close their eyes during a treatment, something they rarely did at home. They allowed their minds to soften. They allowed their breathing to settle. They allowed themselves to exist without performing a role. Some women felt tears prick their eyes during a session, tears they would never allow outside that room. Not because they were ashamed, but because no one else in their lives ever gave them space to release emotion. The nurse might look away politely, pretending not to notice. Professional discretion. A quiet mercy. Others felt their shoulders finally drop, the tension they carried since childhood loosening slowly. Others found the rhythmic motions of massaging devices or the hum of therapeutic machines strangely comforting, not because of their medical effect, but because for once, someone was tending to them without asking anything in return. And perhaps most significantly, these treatments validated something profound. A woman's emotional experience was real enough to require care. Even if the vocabulary was outdated, even if the diagnosis was misguided, the act of acknowledging that women needed rest and comfort mattered. These clinical spaces became the only places where a woman's inner life was indirectly recognized. Not openly, not with emotional depth, but recognized nevertheless. Imagine her leaving the clinic after a session. The street outside feels louder by contrast. The wind sharper. The noise of the streetcar brighter. Yet she walks differently. Lighter. Her body feels grounded. Her mind feels clear. And for the rest of the day, though she returns to her duties, she carries within her the memory of that quiet room, its calm, its warmth, its permission. Did the therapy cure her? No, because there was nothing to cure. The condition was simply her humanity struggling against the rigid expectations placed upon her. But the comfort, the moment of rest, the chance to breathe, the feeling of being tended to instead of tending to others, That was real. That mattered. Some women visited clinics weekly, others monthly, others only once or twice, yet remembered the experience for years afterward, not because the treatment itself was remarkable, but because it was one of the few times someone acknowledged their exhaustion without judgment. It is tempting to view these treatments with modern eyes, to critique the medical misunderstandings of the era. But doing so would miss the emotional truth that made these therapies so significant. They allowed women, in an era of silence, to be vulnerably human. They gave women a socially acceptable way to say, "I am tired. I need support. I can't carry everything alone," even if they never said those words aloud. In this sense, the medical world of the 1920s, flawed as it was created unexpected sanctuaries. Rooms where women found a form of healing that society did not know how to offer them. And perhaps the most poetic truth of all is this: behind every treatment was not a cure, but a quiet moment where a woman finally felt seen. Seen not as a helper, not as a hostess, not as a caretaker, but as a person with an inner landscape deserving of care. And even though the terminology has faded, the emotional need it tried to address remains as timeless as the women who walked through those clinic doors a century ago. Tonight, we turn to one of the most intimate sanctuaries of all, a world made not of silk, water, or music, but of words. Quiet words written in small notebooks. Whispered words printed in secret chapters of paperbacks. Imagined words that floated through a woman's mind while she scrubbed the floor, waited at the stove, or rode the streetcar home after another long day. If the bath soothed the body and radio soothed the spirit, then literature, both read and written, soothed the soul. To understand this world, imagine a woman slipping a thin book beneath her pillow. It is not scandalous, not dangerous, just a modest romance novel with worn pages and a cover illustration fading from too many discreet readings. She does not flaunt it on the living room table. She does not tell neighbors about it. She reads it at night or in quiet minutes between chores, turning its pages carefully as if each chapter were a secret she must guard. Because, in a way, it is. In the 1920s, women's inner emotional lives were rarely spoken of openly. It was not considered proper to discuss longing, loneliness, imagination, or private hopes. And because society offered so little space for honest expression, women created their own spaces, fragile, handwritten, bound in thread, tucked between bedsheets or hidden in sewing baskets. These spaces were called diaries, but in truth they were much more. A diary was a woman's only place where she could write in her true voice. Not the polite voice she used with guests. Not the measured tone she used with family. Not the gentle composure expected of her at all times. But her own voice, unfiltered, tender, thoughtful, hopeful, frustrated, curious. A voice that belonged to no one else but her. But because even diaries felt dangerous in households full of curious siblings, suspicious mothers-in-law, or strict husbands, many women developed their own systems of coded writing. Some wrote in a mix of languages, English sprinkled with Latin, French, or phrases remembered from school. Some used metaphors so ambiguous that only they could understand their meaning. Some wrote emotions as weather patterns. Storm approaching. Quiet fog today. Warm breeze in the afternoon. Some invented symbols only they could decipher. The act of writing itself was not merely recording life, it was claiming emotional ownership of it. The diary allowed her to confess. I felt overwhelmed today. I wish things were different. I miss a part of myself I can't speak of. I dream of something beyond this town. She did not need permission. She did not need validation. She did not need anyone's understanding. Her diary understood. And through these small, coded entries, women created tiny universes where their minds could breathe. But diaries were not the only refuge. There were the books, the quiet revolutionaries of the bedside table. Not the heavy classics displayed proudly on living room shelves, but the slender romance paperbacks sold at train stations, drugstores, or tucked into mail-order catalogs. These stories did not need to be profound. They did not need to win awards. They simply needed to speak to a woman's emotional world in a way society never did. These books gave her permission to feel things she could not name publicly: tenderness, longing, curiosity, hope. They offered characters who wrestled with expectations just as she did. They offered journeys that stretched beyond the edges of her daily life. And most importantly, they offered possibilities. In their pages, a woman could imagine lives larger than her own. Traveling to cities she would never visit. Meeting people she would never encounter. Experiencing adventures she could only dream of. Books gave women emotional vocabulary when society gave them none. Romance stories, though dismissed by critics, became emotional companions. They allowed women to explore affection, vulnerability, courage, and connection without crossing any social lines. They were maps of the heart disguised as entertainment. And the connection between books and diaries formed a quiet circle. She read to spark feelings. She wrote to understand them. She created a private world inside herself, nourished by imagination, protected by her own secrecy. Imagine her at night, lying in bed with a candle flickering beside her. She reads a paragraph, closes the book, and lets her mind drift. The characters linger in her thoughts. Their emotions echo inside her, awakening something she had pushed aside all day. She opens her diary, writes a few phrases, then hesitates, not because she is afraid, but because she wants to preserve the moment just a little longer. In that quiet gap between reading and writing, she feels profoundly connected to her own inner life. And that connection is a treasure most of the world will never see. Writing and reading became emotional forms of self-definition, allowing women to piece together identities that were more expansive than the narrow boxes society assigned them. Through imaginative stories, they remembered they had inner landscapes. Through diaries, they learned to tend these landscapes with care. And the beauty of this secret world was that it did not depend on luxury. A woman did not need wealth to own a notebook. She did not need social status to enjoy a paperback. She did not need permission to dream. Even the simplest diary, a stitched notebook bought for pennies, could hold entire galaxies of her inner experience. Some women wrote about their daily routines in great detail, then slipped in a single coded line revealing the truth beneath the surface. Some wrote only when their hearts felt heavy or hopeful. Some used diaries as a mirror, others as a compass. Some left pages blank for months, then filled them with a sudden flood of emotion. And some, in moments of courage, wrote openly without code, trusting that their diary would protect them as fiercely as they protected it. These diaries became emotional time capsules. They preserved the quiet battles women fought internally. They recorded dreams society never asked about. They captured hopes society never encouraged. They held the truths women whispered only to themselves. In the privacy of ink and paper, women reclaimed pieces of themselves. Even in marriages where conversation felt distant. Even in households where emotions felt tightly controlled. Even in workplaces where they were expected to be mechanical and precise. Even in towns where gossip could destroy reputations. The diary knew her in ways no one else did. And as for imagination, that vast, shimmering world inside her mind, it was not just escape, it was sustenance. Through imagination, she learned to see herself not as a supporting character in other people's lives, but as the protagonist of her own. She wrote small scenes in her mind, walking through a city street alone, buying flowers for herself, learning a craft, traveling on a ship, or simply sitting quietly in a place where no one demanded anything from her. Imagination gave her agency long before society did. And as she navigated the emotional obstacles of her era, imagination gave her a soft landing. A place where she could dream safely. A place where she could understand herself gently. A place where she could rehearse futures she might one day pursue. The world saw her as composed. Her diary knew her as complex. Her books knew her as curious. Her imagination knew her as limitless. Together, these three created a private emotional universe that helped her survive and even thrive in a society that was not designed to hear her inner voice. It is easy, a century later, to see diaries and romance books as trivial. But to the women who lived quietly in the shadows of expectation, they were lifelines, tender, fragile, handwritten lifelines. They reminded her that she had a voice, even if she was not allowed to use it publicly. They reminded her that she had depth, even if the world preferred her shallow. They reminded her that she had dreams, even if she never spoke them aloud. And they reminded her, most of all, that she had a rich, layered, emotional self-worth preserving. Tonight, we step out of the clinic and away from the coded pages of secret diaries. We step back into the home, but not the home as a place of endless tasks or expectations. Instead, we enter the home the way only a woman living inside it would know it, not as a stage of chores, but as a constellation of tiny sanctuaries hidden in plain sight. Because even when the world offered little space for women to rest, they carved out small pockets of refuge in the most ordinary places. To understand this, imagine a quiet corner of a 1920s living room. The lamplight is soft. The ticking of the clock is steady. On the surface, it looks like an ordinary evening scene. But to the woman who lives here, this corner might be her favorite refuge, a spot where she lets her thoughts breathe. It could be an old armchair with a cushion that remembers the shape of her back. It could be the 3 wooden floorboards near the window where the afternoon sun always lands. It could be the kitchen table late at night, after everyone is asleep, when its surface becomes a blank canvas for her thoughts. It did not have to be luxurious. It did not have to be beautiful. It only needed to feel hers. Women of the 1920s lived in houses full of people, responsibilities, and unspoken expectations. But within these homes, they created emotional hiding places, small spaces where they could reset, reflect, or simply exist without the weight of performance. Let us imagine her in one of these moments. She finishes her chores earlier than expected, or the children fall asleep quickly, or her husband is at work, coming home late from an evening shift. She wipes her hands on her apron, glances around to make sure she has a moment to herself, and then instead of collapsing from exhaustion, she seeks out her private refuge. Maybe it is the corner of the couch where the fabric has grown soft over time. She folds her legs beneath her, pulling a blanket up to her chin. She does not need a book or a task. She just sits there, letting silence wash over her. For the first time that day, she feels the gentle weight of the blanket like a hug she does not have to return. Or maybe it is the kitchen. There is something magical about kitchens at night, the way the lamps make everything golden, the way the shadows pool under chairs, the way the room finally stops demanding anything from her. She pours a glass of water, leans against the countertop, and lets her mind drift. The clink of the glass against the sink is the only sound. A simple domestic object becomes a companion in a moment of quiet clarity. Or maybe it is her bedroom, not the bed itself, but the little stool beside the vanity. She sits there and runs a brush through her hair. Slow, thoughtful strokes. 30 strokes. 40. 50. She watches herself in the mirror, not for beauty, not for judgment, but for presence. For proof that she is still there underneath everything the day has painted onto her. These moments seem small, insignificant, even, but to a woman whose emotional life must remain silent, these moments become lifelines. Sometimes the refuge came from objects rather than spaces. A teacup she always chose because it fit perfectly in her hands. A shawl knitted years ago that still smelled faintly of lavender. A ribbon she tucked into her pocket because the color made her feel hopeful. A well-worn cookbook that reminded her of her mother's voice. A cushion she hugged loosely while staring out at the moonlit street. These small things grounded her in her own humanity. Because in a world that treated women's emotions as inconvenient, women learned to hide their feelings in objects and quietly to take them back out again when they needed comfort. Imagine her holding a teacup close to her chest on a cold evening. The steam warms her skin. The scent calms her. The cup becomes more than an object, it becomes a vessel for her inner world. It holds her thoughts, her fatigue, her hope for an easier tomorrow. For these brief minutes she allows herself to pause, breathe, and just be. Or picture her smoothing her hand across a table she has polished 100 times. But this time, instead of seeing it as a chore, she sees it as a moment of grounding, the grain of the wood beneath her palm, the coolness, the familiarity. The table is not just furniture. It is an anchor. Some women found sanctuary in everyday tasks too, not because they loved the tasks themselves, but because certain movements allowed their minds to wander freely. Folding laundry became a kind of meditation. Sweeping the floor became rhythmic, almost soothing. Grinding coffee beans in the early morning became a ritual that reminded her she had control over small pieces of her day. These tasks offered predictable comfort in a world full of unpredictable expectations. A woman in 1927 might knead dough, feeling tension leave her body each time she pressed her palms forward. She might hum softly to herself. And in those moments, the act became a form of quiet healing disguised as domesticity. She was not performing. She was not being watched. She was not fulfilling a role. She was letting her breath find its natural rhythm again. Even the act of arranging flowers in a cheap vase could become a reminder that beauty existed in small places. She might take her time, adjusting petals, trimming stems, appreciating the gentle colors. And as she worked, she reclaimed a sense of gentleness that life often denied her. Sometimes the refuge was not a place or an object, but a moment. The moment right after sunset, when the sky turned velvet blue. The moment right before dawn, when the house was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. The moment when she stood by the window, watching a single street lamp glow like a guardian of the night. These were the moments when she felt most herself. In these fragments of peace, she did not need to be strong. She did not need to be gracious or composed. She did not need to tuck her feelings behind her smile. She did not need to be perfect. She just needed to feel human. And everyday objects, soft pillows, worn fabrics, familiar scents gave her permission to exist without pressure. She found refuge in the scent of bread, baking, in the sound of a kettle whistling, in the gentle creak of her rocking chair, in the softness of warm socks, in the way lamplight flickered against the wallpaper. These tiny comforts stitched themselves into the emotional fabric of her life. It was not that she needed grandeur. She needed grounding. She needed reminders of herself. And so she made sanctuaries out of the simplest things because the simple things were hers. No one questioned them. No one controlled them. No one judged them. They were small islands of autonomy in a life filled with tides of expectation. Even the layout of her home became a secret emotional map. This chair for thinking. That drawer for small treasures. This corner for rest. That quiet hallway for private tears. The back porch for stolen breezes in the evening. No one else knew the meaning of these spaces. But she did. Each one carried a different kind of peace. A woman's emotional survival in the 1920s was not built on dramatic acts of rebellion. It was built on quiet ingenuity, her ability to create meaning out of the mundane, to build private sanctuaries out of ordinary life, to transform simple objects into small sources of strength. And in this way, she wove a hidden world beneath the surface of her daily routine, a world filled with tenderness, resilience, and quiet hope. A world no one else saw, but one she carried with her. Every single day. Tonight, we arrive at the last chamber of this hidden world, the place where individual struggles, quiet rituals, private comforts, and secret longings softly merge into something larger than any single woman. A place woven not from objects or moments, but from human connection. A place shaped by the silent, loyal, intuitive bonds women formed with one another in an era that rarely acknowledged their emotional depth. Because beneath the surface of the 1920s, beneath corsets, chores, composure, routines, diaries, and coded medical language, there existed a network of women who understood one another without needing to explain a thing. Call it sisterhood. Call it alliance. Call it shared humanity. Whatever the name, it was real, powerful, and quietly transformative. To feel it, imagine a 1920s woman stepping out of her house on a busy morning. She carries grocery bags or laundry, or a stack of envelopes for the post. She seems poised, steady, politely pleasant. But beneath this exterior lies the same emotional landscape we have walked through in all the previous ideas: longing, burdens, tenderness, curiosity, fatigue, small joys, quiet dreams. Now imagine her passing a neighbor woman on the street. Just a nod. 2 seconds. Yet in that glance, an entire conversation takes place, one that neither could ever speak aloud. Tired today. Me too. Hanging in there. Doing my best. Let us keep going. This was the language of sisterhood, unspoken, intuitive, invisible to those who did not know how to listen. Throughout the 1920s, women supported each other in ways history books rarely record. Their support was not loud or political, though some participated in activism. It was emotional, domestic, ordinary, sacred. They helped each other breathe. They kept each other afloat. They saw one another's interior lives even when society insisted those inner worlds did not exist. Some friendships were obvious: shared recipes, garden visits, sewing circles, church groups, lunch breaks behind office buildings. But others were far subtler. A neighbor who brought warm bread by chance on a day she sensed the other woman needed kindness. A co-worker who slipped an uplifting note into a friend's desk drawer. A sister who brushed her sibling's hair silently, knowing the simple gesture might help ease a difficult day. A friend who shared a book with pages already worn, saying only, "You might like this one," meaning so much more. These gestures were not trivial. They were survival. Because women of the 1920s lived in a world where expressing emotional truth openly was considered improper, their friendships became the hidden spaces where truth was allowed to breathe. Imagine two women sitting together in a small parlor on a winter afternoon. One knits, the other reads. Neither says much. But the silence between them is gentle. It is a silence that says, "You do not need to pretend with me. You do not need to be perfect. I know the weight you carry because I carry my own." In this quiet companionship, emotional walls softened, sometimes without a single sentence. Sisterhood also grew in shared tasks. Women washed clothes together at public laundries. They chatted while shelling peas. They exchanged tiny secrets over clotheslines that stretched from one backyard to another. These simple, domestic activities became the background for deeply human support systems. A woman might tell a friend, "I could not sleep last night." She would not explain why. She did not need to. The friend already knew the feeling. Another might say, "I have been restless lately." The friend would nod knowingly, offering no judgment, only understanding. Women developed a special kind of empathy, the kind built not from elaborate conversations but from shared experience. They learned to read one another, not through words but through tone, posture, gestures, even the way someone set a teacup on the table. They knew when a friend was overwhelmed. They knew when she needed a moment alone. They knew when she needed a joke or a recipe or a quiet evening with no expectations at all. These small acts formed emotional lifelines. And there was humor, the kind women shared privately, gentle or mischievous, full of warmth. A whispered comment about a neighbor's grand hat. A shared laugh over a spilled pie. A raised eyebrow during a dull community meeting. These moments did not just lighten the day. They bonded hearts. Humor became a rebellion of softness, connection, and shared humanity. Some friendships were forged in workplaces, women typing at long desks, passing glances during hectic hours, sharing lunches in near whispered conversations that grew into trust. Office friendships were transformative. For the first time, women saw one another outside domestic expectations. They saw ambition, talent, intelligence, determination. These friendships helped redefine how women saw themselves. And in boarding houses, shared apartments, dormitories, and city rooms, women created little families out of non-family members. They cooked together, fixed hems together, shared secrets while braiding one another's hair or preparing for bed. They protected one another from loneliness. Bonds held emotional truths rarely spoken aloud. We are all trying. We all feel more than we can say. We can hold one another up. In moments of difficulty, illness, heartbreak, exhaustion, financial worries, these quiet alliances became essential. A friend knocked on the door with soup. A sister watched the children for an afternoon. A neighbor lent an ear without criticism. A co-worker covered a shift. Women became one another's safety nets long before society ever tried to build official ones. This sisterhood was also intergenerational. Older women taught younger women how to navigate expectations. Younger women taught older women how to navigate modernity. Each leaned on the other in different ways. But perhaps the most beautiful truth of all is this. These friendships gave women emotional permission, something society refused to give them. A woman could cry with a friend without being called dramatic. She could confess her dreams without being mocked. She could admit exhaustion without being labeled weak. She could laugh freely, speak honestly, or sit in silence without needing to perform. Through one another, women rediscovered parts of themselves they had hidden. A friend might say, "You deserve rest." Another might say, "You are stronger than you think." Another, "You light up a room." These sentences rewrote the internal narratives women had been taught gently, steadily, lovingly. Through quiet sisterhood, women affirmed one another's emotional realities and provided the recognition society denied them. Imagine her going to bed after spending time with a friend. She lies down, the room dim, the house settling lightly around her. She smiles softly at something her friend said. She feels understood. She feels lighter. She feels less alone. This quiet comfort, the comfort of being seen, might carry her through the week. Because in the end, the hidden communities women built among themselves were not just friendships. They were emotional havens. They were networks of resilience. They were proof that connection can flourish even under silence. Women of the 1920s did not always have the freedom to speak openly. So they learned to speak softly. To speak through gestures. To speak through kindness. To speak through presence. And through this gentle language, they built something extraordinary. A sisterhood that held their hearts when the world could not. As we reach the end of this journey, we begin to see something remarkable. Each of the 12 hidden worlds we explored, the whispered taboos, the coded catalogs, the warmth of bathwater, the soft glow of late-night radio, the quiet freedom of solo dancing, the secret power of silk, the misunderstood medical treatments, the private landscapes of books and diaries, the emotional sanctuaries woven into everyday household corners, and the gentle sisterhoods that held women together were never separate stories. They were threads. Delicate, nearly invisible, but strong. Threads woven through the inner lives of women who lived a century ago. Together, they form a tapestry not loud, not rebellious in the ways history often celebrates, but deeply human. A tapestry of resilience carried out in silence. Of small joys hidden beneath layers of expectation. Of resistance expressed through softness. Of strength shaped not through confrontation but through care. What we discover in these stories is not simply the hardship of being a woman in the 1920s. We discover the beauty of their inner worlds, how they nurtured themselves in private, how they reclaimed moments for their spirits, how they protected the parts of themselves the world refused to see. These women were not merely surviving. They were preserving themselves. In the hush of ordinary rooms. In the rhythm of secret rituals. In the pages of hidden journals. In shared looks between friends. In the softness of fabrics only they ever touched. In moments of dancing when everyone else had gone to sleep. In stories they read under blankets. In the warmth of water that washed away a day's burdens. In laughter shared quietly so as not to wake the children. In kindness passed from one woman's hands to another's. Their world may have been restricted, but their inner lives were boundless. They built sanctuaries out of the smallest things. They turned ordinary life into emotional refuge. They learned to hold themselves gently even when the world did not. And as we close this chapter, we honor not just their struggles but their artistry, the artistry of living softly in a world that demanded hardness, of finding freedom in private corners, of tending inner gardens no one else ever saw. Perhaps, in listening to their stories, we are reminded of something timeless. That self-care does not always look like grand gestures. Sometimes it is a warm bath, a familiar chair, a secret notebook, a favorite song, a shared smile, a single moment where the heart feels safe. These women left no monuments, no manifestos, no roaring speeches. But they left something stronger. A legacy of quiet resilience, the kind that lives in the everyday, the ordinary, the deeply personal. A reminder that even behind closed doors, humanity breathes its fullest. Thank you for walking with me through these private worlds, for listening, feeling, and remembering the lives that history often overlooks. And now, as we close the door gently behind this story, I want to say, thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for spending this quiet moment with me. Wherever you are, whatever day you have had, I hope you find your own little sanctuary, your own softness, your own place to breathe. Good night, everyone. And until we meet again, take gentle care of yourself.